Коллеги, я несколько слов скажу в качестве введения на русском, потом мы перейдем на английский. У нас сегодня рабочий язык английский. Адам у нас ключевой спикер. Я знаю, что Адам знает несколько базовых конструкций на русском языке и знает русский уже на уровне заслуживающем уважения.
В следующий раз.
Мы рассчитываем, что на следующих итерациях нашего сотрудничества мы уже сможем на русском языке какие-то элементы закрывать. Мы проводили уже семинар с Адамом, по-моему, 1,5 года назад, и тогда как раз профессор Сталкер показал нам первые результаты своего исследования о влиянии санкций на энергетические компании. Сегодня мы подробнее об этом. Сегодня мы подробнее об этом поговорим. И вы знаете, что мы в РСМД тоже ведем целый ряд исследований по санкционной проблематике. Вот сейчас мы практически закончили большое исследование по применению вторичных санкций. Сегодня вышел доклад с первыми результатами на базе Валдайского клуба. Базовый доклад с основным анализом у нас выйдет в качестве доклада РСМД в июле. Я рассчитываю его сдать в нашу редакцию. Ну и также серия научных статей будет. И вот мы сейчас с Адамом сидели, смотрели наши данные, сопоставляли их, пришли к выводу, что у нас есть много совпадающих интерпретаций. И, в общем, сегодняшнее наше выступление так или иначе будут взаимосвязаны. Я рад вас приветствовать у нас в РСМД. Спасибо, что вы пришли. Now I'm switching to English. And give a floor to Professor Stallberg. Please, floor is yours.
Thank you, Ivan. As I said, следующий раз я говорю по-русски. К сожалению, я забыл много слов. Не могу сделать. Так. I guess today we're going to have more of a discussion, but to maybe start the thinking about it, I wanted to say a few words about, I guess, some of our research that we're doing now at Georgia Tech. And I don't need to tell, I don't need to explain to all of you that we're at a very curious, if not paradoxical moment with respect to sanctions. Today, sanctions are the preferred policy, not only in the United States, but in Europe, and energy state and economic statecraft are also prominent in Russian behavior as well. And so we have an increasing gravitation to sanctions, and in the United States, that effort has actually been codified in a legal context with Congress mandating sanctions, which the last time they did that was Jackson Vanik, and it takes a long time to remove those types of sanctions. So these are now legally mandated in the United States. So we have an increasing propensity and prevalence of sanctions behavior. At the same time, we see very little direct evidence of effectiveness, of success. Obviously, the specific purpose of the sanctions in the West case of the United States and EU relates to changing absolute behavior with respect to Ukraine, and Syria, election meddling, and other issues, Skripal, etc. But there's it's a binary effort, and there's very little evidence that the direct ambitions have been realized. There's some discussion about indirect effects, but there's little evidence to date of those indirect effects. In the United States, for example, there's discussion that somehow the sanctions have discouraged or deterred Russia from taking further action in Ukraine. But again, there's no evidence that Russia was actually planning to take that further action. So it's hard to see what the evidence would be given the counterfactual nature of those claims. So there's a reliance on sanctions, little direct and little indirect evidence of success, yet at the same time, all parties are almost complacent about this current situation of increased reliance on sanctions and little tangible evidence of success. In the United States, there's a sense that sanctions are, that the executive and now the legislature has to do something, but sanctions are the least bad option for easing domestic political pressure to do something. So, and in Russia, there's growing confidence in the resilience to sanctions, especially given the short-term evidence of, with respect to shifts in GDP, etc., and the growing, different sectors benefiting from sanctions, then through import substitution measures. So we're in this very strange world where we're relying on sanctions, they're not having the effect, and everybody seems to be going along as if this is okay, and that there are little costs to continuing moving down this path. And so what I wanted to do in my research and with my group is to dissect that, to see if in fact sanctions are not having those negative impact and that they are cost-free. And if they are cost-free, what does that mean about the strategic value of sanctions? So that's what the nature of my research is. And what distinguishes my research from some of the earlier work is that we're trying to bring different data analytical approaches to the problem by doing large text mining and data analytics with texts and with abstracts to see if Americans versus Europeans versus different Russian communities think about sanctions differently. In other words, are we approaching the problem differently? And if we are approaching the problem differently, that may have implications for how effective our signals are in threatening sanctions. So that's one part of it. Another part looks at the issue of whether or not sanctions are having any kind of effect. Is there, in the United States, we call the Russian sanctions reciprocal sanctions, with the assumption that when the West imposes sanctions, Russians then impose counter sanctions. But do they? Or is there an asymmetric response that is more about domestic resilience and protecting against sanctions? Or is there an orthogonal response where Russia's international behavior is not at all related to sanctions, but it may be a pattern in either their other forms of coercive behavior or otherwise? Evidence to the latter may suggest that, again, sanctions may not be cost-free. We just haven't been looking in the right places to understand the effects. And for that, we're trying to bring events data to the table, because there are a lot of databases out there, but they're very structured, and most of them end in 2010, maybe 2012. But there's very, very little purchase on what's going on since then. And there are these events data sets that are updated every 15 minutes that capture different types of reporting. Now, it's not hard evidence, but it captures changes in tones and discussions around events. So that may give us a cue as to where to look more substantively. So we want to look to see what these larger databases of events reporting globally may show for any patterns of behavior. So that's the second strain. The third strain is looking more sophisticated at the nature of relationships between companies to see, in fact, if these sanctions are not having any impact or not on company relationships. And one of the ways that we've been looking at this in the energy sector, which I talked about a year and a half ago that Yvonne mentioned, is looking at the trust and the social capital between companies that are corporate strategic alliances in different sectors. And so I'll show you some of that data where we look at the type, we code different types of investment between companies, reflecting stronger or weaker ties between those companies, and which companies are very strong to those corporate relationships, and if they're being sanctioned, what does that do to the corporate alliance? So that's the third strand of our data analytic approach. So I don't want to take up too much time, but I'll just give you a flavor of what some of that looks like, and then maybe we can talk more broadly about it. So I don't need to go too much into this. This, you all know that it's hard to measure the effectiveness of sanctions. And as we mentioned, there's very little direct effect. You need to incorporate not only the explicit intention of the sanction and the actual behavior of the target, but you also need to look at the target's countermeasures. In other words, whether or not it's resilient, and so therefore an asymmetric response. And so most of the literature doesn't talk about how Russia has gone to increasingly protect itself in its domestic industries. But also, there's not, even when there is data on surmising that the Western sanctions or European sanctions have affected maybe 1 or 1.5% GDP, there's no real analysis of what the impact has been on the European countries. Not just at the EU level, but in different countries or different sectors. So that hasn't been really disaggregated. So even though sanctions are an interactive, a strategic interaction between a sender, a target, and sometimes a black knight or a third party. And there's no real good story that captures that dynamic response. And as we mentioned, there are a lot of discussions about indirect effects, but they require counterfactuals that haven't been examined. But another thing to keep in mind, we talk about sanctions in two ways. One as a threat, and two as a punishment. And a lot of times we confuse those things. And certainly policymakers use those things interchangeably. But if you're thinking about sanctions as a threat to deter or to coerce, there are different elements that have to be met between the credibility, the resolve, as well as the capability. And not all of those have been really explored. And so that's, of course, the backdrop. But let's look at how different communities understand the sanctions literature. So from an academic, or I should say a scholarly but also policy analytic perspective, this is looking at the web of science and the number of articles written by authors from Western or US and European institutions versus those based in Russian institutions. So we didn't look at whether or not the scholars got a Russian last name or not, but we're looking whether or not they're writing for different institutions. And you can actually see that Russian scholarship and Russian writing on sanctions has actually gone up quite considerably over the recent period for obvious reasons, but it is kind of interesting. One of the things that's also different about these communities, and this is about 1,200 articles that go back from 2000. And this is, again, Web of Science, which is the largest repository of reports. And it also has a rather large collection of Russian scholarship. And here you can see some of the distinctions in the ways that the communities operate. There's actually, and this is understandable when you know the different communities, but in the United States, there's a premium put on single-authored pieces. So most of the articles are by single authors, but to the extent that there's joint authorship in the United States, there's a lot of times it's an international, American, European, or different European authors. And so you see, one thing that comes out of this is that while the Russian community has been writing a lot on sanctions lately, it's relatively insular. It's writing, their authors are writing amongst themselves as opposed to a cross-fertilization with the West. This is looking at the citations of those different articles. And you can see there are a couple things that stand out. I don't know if you know many of these authors, but one of the things that stands out is that, first off, there are very few common reference points in the scholarship. Another thing is that the Russian articles tend to focus on those common elements that talk about the ineffectiveness of sanctions. Most of these, the Hofbauer, points to the 30%, of sanctions working. Pape is very critical of sanctions. Dresner, on the other hand, talks about the conditionality of sanctions. So there's I would say a little bit more optimism or caveats in the Western literature, and there's generally the area of commonality is about the negative nature of sanctions. Another thing that's interesting, here's when we broke up the different segments of the literature. This is this is based on how the authors, when you write an article, you identify keywords, the topics that your article most pertains to. So this is using using software that extracts the keywords in the titles and the abstracts of the pieces, and you see that in the West, there's a tendency to focus on the strategic dimension to sanctions, and looking at sanctions as an element of statecraft, as a strategic tool of statecraft. And when you zoom in this more, especially in the American writings, we talk a lot about more unilateral types of sanctions as an element of great power politics. In the Russian literature, there's a very different set of clusters of topics, or of keywords that are associated primarily with their ineffectiveness and impact on trade, the impact on macroeconomic issues, and on the social and on the financial sector, social effects in financial areas. So this is using how authors define their topics. Then we used software to actually look for clusters of words in titles and abstracts to see if the algorithms could pick up different clusterings. And you see that in general, you have the same kinds of general clusters of the Russian community into sort of trade, macroeconomic issues, and financial and social effects. And there's a much wider range of issues that are talked about on the Western side, but mostly related to sort of statecraft and great power politics. And we're using different tools and different databases. So this is just using, right now, the bibliometrics, off of Web of Science. But then what we did was we went to one of the largest repositories of full text articles, the ProQuest holdings and English language holdings, and this is we were able to break it down using software to identify different types of terms, the frequency of terms that come out, and basically in the corpus we have of about 1,700 articles, 25% are written by scholars associated or directly affiliated with a Russian institution. Okay, so that's the black line, about 25%. So anything to the right of that black line is a frequency that exceeds that normalization, and anything to the left of it is less than the normalization. And you can see, again, that it's sort of import substitution, trade-related issues, as opposed to the strategic use of sanctions comes out in the text mining. So this is what we're doing now to try to capture whether or not we're actually talking past each other. And so what I've showed you is how the scholarly and policy analytic community thinks about it. Well, we're now in the process of taking Russian periodicals and Russian language sources, this is English language, and doing the same thing, using the same tools for and mining some of the text to see if in the more popular literature and the policy relevant literature, not only are these themes echoed, but if they vary according to different groups, maybe different parts of Russia talk about sanctions differently because they may be dominated by a particular sector or not, or different interest groups, the different economic groups may have different sentiments, to see if there's actually much more disaggregated view, and then to compare that with the same thing that we were doing on the English language side for the US and Europe. So but one of the things that comes out here is that, at least at base, we tend to talk about sanctions and write about sanctions and think about sanctions in very different ways. At base, in the United States especially, we talk about them and write about them as a strategic instrument. We write a lot about unilateral sanctions, okay, and we talk about the conditionality of effectiveness of sanctions. Whereas in the Russian community, there's a general sense that it's overwhelmingly about trade, macroeconomic stability, and some limited focus on the social and financial effects. But to the extent that there is a discourse on the statecraft dimension of sanctions, it's generally pessimistic about the effectiveness of sanctions. Sanctions are seen primarily as a tactical instrument as opposed to a strategic instrument. And to the extent that they can be effective, they need to be associated with international law and in more of a multilateral context. So again, very different frames around that. Okay, so the second point that I mentioned was behavior. And there's something that, we've been talking a lot about the absence of direct evidence of success, the problems with the counterfactuals. Some people have been writing about the domestic response to sanctions as opposed to a foreign policy response, in terms of import substitution and insulating and becoming more resilient. But one of the things but there have been a number of Russian studies that have actually begun to start polling different economic sectors, industrial sectors, to get a sense of what Russian companies are thinking about. So there's some qualitative surveys that emphasize that the companies that see the greatest perception of threat imposed by sanctions are those that are, in the West, we think that there's a tendency actually in the United States, especially in the US government, that globally exposed Russian companies are the most vulnerable to sanctions, and by sanctioning them, you'll be able to raise the costs on those companies, so they will put pressure on the political decision makers to change their policy, right? But actually, when you look at the perception of risk among Russian businesses, it's not those that are globally exposed. They discriminate. It's not all companies that are involved in the international market feel the pressure of sanctions. In fact, it's primarily those that are either working with Ukraine or Europe that are more sensitive to sanctions, but those that are working with China or elsewhere tend not to regard sanctions as a great threat. Similarly, state-owned companies tend to perceive the threat of sanctions as greater than private companies. That said, among the private companies, it's the parents as opposed to the subsidiaries that tend to feel more of the threat, which I think echoes some of your findings on the U.S. side. And it's interesting, those companies that are on the domestic frontier, in other words, they're at the higher end of the competitiveness in the domestic market and are looking to get into the international market, they're the most sensitive to sanctions. Those that are already in the international market have a little bit more complacency because they feel like they may potentially diversify. Those that are not competitive in the domestic market are beneficiaries of import substitution, and so they actually see themselves as actually benefiting from sanctions. So it's those middle type of firms that are very competitive at home that wanted to make the transition into the global supply chain that feel the greatest perception of threat. And then those that are involved in the global supply chain do see that threat. And similarly in the energy sector, It's those that are primarily concerned about moving across the value stream as opposed to up through the value stream tend to perceive more of a threat. But this is sort of qualitative evidence. This is based on small surveys of different firms that has been written about in the literature. But one of the things that we, to go back, in much of the work that is being done on whether or not Russia is responding to sanctions or is it reciprocating or not, is based on a very narrow set of data. As I mentioned, this is taking the GDELT, the global database of sentiment and tone, language and tone. It's updated every 15 minutes. It has millions of counts. Now, it doesn't have factual, it's not all factual, it's about reporting. And so there may be an article about something here or there. So you can't rely on this as fact, but it can pick up sentiments about an uptick in a discussion about things. So here what we did was we looked for Russian sanctions behavior and a breakdown of sort of U.S. sanctions and U.S. sanction behavior. And so what you see is on the top line, the orange are actual sanctions measures that are taken, and the blue is sort of the threats and and some of the discussions. And you can see there are waves of U.S. sanctions towards Russia. And if you look at the middle level, those are the same kinds of behavior, the behavior and rhetoric of Russia on sanctions. And you can see that this captures the frequency. You can see that there's modest correlation in the frequency of Russia's action and discussion about sanctions relative to the U.S. one. But what really stands out is the frequency and the correlation in the pattern of Russia's broader coercive behavior beyond sanctions. And there is something that suggests that sanctions may not be cost-free, that sanctions may not only lead to domestic resilience, but may lead to other types of international coercive behavior that are not captured by just a narrow focus on sanctions. And then one of the nice things about this data set is that you can begin to disaggregate it, and we can separate out different instruments that suggest the cross-domain elements. And so you see the overwhelming evidence of Russia's coercive behavior has been related to legal and diplomatic actions as opposed to economic or military actions. So just because we do see an uptick maybe in coercive behavior, it may not necessarily be associated with hard-edged types of policies. So this gives us food for thought, and what we're doing now is actually seeing if there's any sort of causal relationship between these patterns. These are just simply patterns in the data, and they may not be related, but they do raise questions about thinking more broadly about the international impact of sanctions. So the last thing I want to mention is on the energy side. We've been talking about pipelines and energy sanctions, LNG sanctions now, as if we live in a world in Europe of just these large trunk pipelines. But in fact, Europe is increasingly networked, not only with pipelines, but around the edges, increasingly LNG facilities. And so when we're talking about sanctions, it's not really this, in the energy context in Europe, it's not really a binary relationship between the sender and target. It now has to be looked at not only in a strategic dimension, but in a networked dimension. And so what we wanted to do is look at some of those network effects. And so what we did was we disaggregated, this is the northern dimension to Europe, the northern corridor surrounding Nord Stream debates. This is since 2009. This is looking at companies' relationships, the quality of company relationships. We're not looking at investments here. We're not looking at flows of gas. We're looking at investments between companies and coding that investment for how much social capital there is. In other words, we code very weakly licensing agreements between companies, and we code as a strong relationship those that have joint R&D, joint ownership, which are very difficult to pull apart. There's a lot of social capital bound up in those relationships. And one of the things that stands out, I mean, the resolution isn't great, but that red circle in the middle is actually Gazprom. And one of the things that comes out is that Gazprom is seen as a trusted party among German, which are the blue gas companies. So basically, this is the Northern Corridor gas sector, okay? And also the purple on the bottom are Polish companies, gas companies, which is actually kind of curious because if you read the political discourse, Poland obviously has a very ardent and strident view about Russia these days, but their gas companies are bound up with Gazprom primarily through German companies. Okay, so you can see, and also, by the way, they're Norwegian and Finnish companies tied in there. So this is very interesting because this can explain something that we've had difficulty explaining just by looking at flows or dependency statements, because German companies, while they buy a lot of gas, they're not, dependent on Russian gas. Baltic states, which are not on this, right, buy a lot of gas, okay? But Baltic states don't enjoy, there's not a lot of social capital between Gazprom and the Baltic states. They're primarily licensing agreements. So when there was the opportunity for a floating LNG facility to come on board, it was very easy for Lithuania to shift and take advantage of that, and the Russian Gazprom realized that and offered them a 27% discount in their gas. But the point is, when we just look at flows of gas, we can't explain why countries that buy a lot of gas from Gazprom would be supportive of sanctions, and those countries that don't buy a lot of gas or not dependent are concerned about sanctions. But when you start looking at the social capital between, you can begin to understand the relationships that may be affected the longer sanctions are put in place, because in this, should Gazprom be more directly sanctioned and specific existing projects sanctioned, you're going to see a lot of social capital potentially be put at risk. And so that's a different way of measuring the impact of relationships and sanctions on these relationships. So, one of the things I wanted to show you also is we took Rusal, by the way. We were curious because there was a lot of discussion about what are the costs of sanctioning Rusal, and of course we know that Rusal is very important to the global supply chain of aluminum, which got a lot of play. But one thing that our research shows is that Rusal is connected to a couple of other networks through its investments. There's a Chinese network, but there's also a network through Areva. And then through Areva, there are a number of American, primarily nuclear energy companies. And so sanctions on Rusal would have actually begun to stress some of the social capital that exists indirectly between American companies and Areva, because Areva was going to be directly affected by those sanctions. So it gives you another sense of how to think about the secondary effects of sanctions or not. So these are just different ways you can use some of the broader data that's out there to maybe have a more sophisticated take on thinking about sanctions. And so the bottom line here is that we need to have a much more nuanced view, and we need to think very carefully about those network and secondary effects of sanctions. We need to beware of cheap talk. In the United States especially, we sort of think that sanctions are cost-free. They're the least bad option. But actually, there's no free lunch. And there may be not only asymmetric but orthogonal costs associated with these sanctions. And over time, we could be eroding the important social capital that exists between companies and strategic alliances that could really complicate our business landscape. So let me stop there.
Thanks a lot, Adam. I'm really glad that you managed to come to RIAC, and it's great that we made this event. And the explanation is very simple. I was intrigued by your presentation of Vologda. We together participated yesterday in a session on sanctions in US-Russia relations, and Adam highlighted key points, but we didn't have time to go deep into details. Now I got much deeper understanding of what you are doing, and that's really great, especially in terms of data and networking analysis. Thanks a lot. So now I will try to elaborate a bit on sanctions efficiency from my side. Adam started about this. Started his presentation from this issue, and in fact, lots depends on how we understand efficiency, right? And the old school understanding of efficiency of sanctions, and Adam showed this famous name like Gary Hofbauer and his colleagues and others, and Dan Dresner, of course, and Robert Pape and others. They imply that sanctions efficient in situations when they cause the change of behavior of a target state. So what we call this a state-centric approach. The community of those who are dealing with sanctions is quite skeptical about the efficiency in this regard, because the data of 1990 by Hofbauer showed that only 1/3 of cases are leading to change of behavior. Babe showed that it's 5% now. So even now there is a lot of skepticism about this. Dan Dresner coined the term of sanctions paradox when he revealed that sanctions are much more efficient against friends, allies, than against foes. Foes are getting more consolidated, more tough, more angry when there are imposed sanctions, while allies are more loyal to them. So this is an old school basic approach. A couple of other approaches. One of them is related to democracy and policy change inside target state. So it's not a secret that quite often sanctions aim to spur, to stimulate internal changes. And the overall logic is that if the political regime has less resources, then population will be more dissatisfied with the political regime, and they will go to the streets and make a revolt, and kick out the political elite. And the research shows that that's not the case. That's often not the case. So sanctions very often provide completely different result when political systems become more consolidated, and political elites use sanctions as a way to legitimize the existing political course. And if the, let's say, repressions are moderate, not high, then it generally works. So people are not making revolutions after sanctions are imposed. And human rights, of course, in 1991 and in general 1990s, trade embargoes and economic embargoes against Iraq and Yugoslavia promoted the emergence of a new strategy of the use of surgery sanctions, smart sanctions, targeted sanctions to avoid pressure on the population and the sharp decline of the quality of life, and to target those who are, let's say, responsible for foreign policy behavior or internal policy behavior, which initiators do not like. In his reports, Idris Jazairi, a special reporter of UN on sanctions, shows that this is smart sanctions also may make quite a huge harm to people, and it's hard to say that they're efficient in terms of human rights. But all of these dimensions are state-centric in one way or another. What we are proposing is to look at the other side, and our research here at REAC is directed on a different dimension, corporate dimension. So why shouldn't we focus on the effect of sanctions on companies and corporations? So what is their behavior? Because very often not only states are subject to sanctions, but companies, and in many cases they are subject of secondary sanctions, right? So what is secondary sanctions? Secondary sanctions in general, now they are mistakenly associated with exterritorial sanctions. So, and indeed exterritorial sanctions are very often the secondary sanctions, but this is only part of the picture. Secondary sanctions are sanctions for violating sanctions. So, for instance, if hypothetically, Nastya is in the SDN list, and I'm doing business with Nastya, I may be subjected to secondary sanctions. I'm by U.S. regulators, so I may be subjected to penalties, right? Or vice versa. And we gathered a database of 200 cases for the last 10 years. Cases of implementation of secondary sanctions by the US regulator against private and state companies and also individuals. Sometimes individuals also are imposed to secondary sanctions to show to what extent do they change the behavior of companies. And this different vision of efficiency showed that on the corporate level, sanctions are much more effective than on the level of state. So very rare sanctions change the behavior of states, very, very often, and I would say in almost 100%, they change the behavior of companies. And I assume, we should verify it of course, but I assume that this relates to the structure of networks Adam showed. What are our how do we define the efficiency? How we do define the change of behavior of companies? Well, first of all, this is about cooperation with OFAC when sanctions violations is exposed. In 10 years, there is almost no case when companies did not cooperate with OFAC when they were exposed. So a company has a choice to say, get out here, right? We are in our jurisdiction. We are, for instance, a German company or a British company. So we don't care about US legislation, right? But they don't do this. In 99%, they cooperate with the FAC. And there is a reason for this, because for AFAC this is a mitigating factor. So if a company cooperates, it may count for the reduction of penalty. But the truth is that companies are quite loyal. And on the macro level, if you look on the macro level, recent developments around Iran and JCPOA are quite illustrative. And they are quite connected to this state of affairs. When United States withdrew from JCPOA unilaterally, all the other participants of the deal were really angry about this. Europeans, Russians, Chinese. So all of them criticized severely the White House for this. And Europeans re-established the blocking statute of 1996, which protects, theoretically and legally protects European companies from the effect of US sanctions. And in fact, when we call them exterritorial, we should be very careful, because Americans are quite accurate with this. So there is common knowledge that US extends its jurisdiction to other countries. But this is only part of the truth, because For instance, when it comes to the dollars transactions, Americans recognize it as a part of their jurisdiction. So if we use US financial system, if we use US corresponding account, then we are the subject to the US legislation. So in this case, while there is a ground for the US statements and this ambition to use sanctions exterritorially, so they exterritorial only to some degree, right? When sanctions are used against private companies, a considerable part of them, 2/3, take the so-called remedial measures. So they're not just recognizing that yes, we are violating sanctions and we are ready to pay penalty, but they're making concrete steps to improve their compliance policy. They are making trainings, they are spending more money for compliance, they are hiring new people, they are conducting internal audits, they are making external audits, they are improving the due diligence of their partners, they are imposing new software to identify sanctioned persons, etc., etc. So they are making very concrete steps. So in this sense, well, on the corporate level, sanctions are much more effective than on the state level, and we don't have similar things like Dresden's paradox there. But we have another kind of paradox which we revealed and which we reflected in the report which appeared today. We call it European paradox, which is quite funny for us as researchers, not funny for Europeans, and quite comfortable for Americans. So the majority of companies who are getting penalty notices are the American companies. So of 200 cases, 133 are Americans, so 2/3, something like that. Europeans compose only 40 cases, so a minority, about 25%, right? But if you look at the distribution of payments, who pay more? We will see that 133 American companies pay only 3% of the overall sum of penalties, and Europeans pay 83%. And if we add to Europeans Swiss companies, we will have 94%. Well, we have a Pareto distribution. Classical Pareto distribution. 20% of customers bring 80% of profit. 80% of customers bring 20% of profit. So American budget gets most of the profit for sanctions, secondary sanctions from foreign companies, from Europeans, and the majority of them are banks. So in fact, if we say a couple of words about energy sector, I wouldn't say that energy is much affected by secondary sanctions. There are only 14 energy companies sanctioned in the last 10 years, and most of them are not precisely energy, right? They are oil service. These are oil service companies which provide software for oil companies. So these are not oil extraction or gas extraction companies or generating companies. There is, I would say, among the exceptions is ExxonMobil, which was sanctioned a couple of years ago for deals with Rosneft. But most of the energy companies under secondary sanctions are quite small. In global sense of this word, they may have quite active operations worldwide, but in comparison with Rosneft, with Gazprom, with Total and others, they are quite small. And the amount of their payments is incomparable with banks, for instance. Banks pay huge money, really huge penalties, because banks have multiple transactions, millions, billions transactions, while oil companies, oil service companies have, well, quite limited amount of transactions. Well, at least incomparable with banks. And this makes them less vulnerable in comparison with financial sector, because it's much easier to control for compliance department, if they have them. But anyway, it's much easier to control such an amount of transaction in comparison with banks, which have millions of them, billions of them. So on the energy side, in terms of secondary sanctions, everything is more or less good. But this is a top of the iceberg. The problem is that energy companies are affected in terms of financial sanctions. And this desperate vulnerability of banks, which we fix in terms of secondary sanctions, relates to energy companies quite directly. Because if an energy company wants to make a project in a sanctioned country, or if it wants to deal with a sanctioned company, or a counter agent which may appear in the sanctions list, a bank will be a key problem for such a transaction, because a bank will say that, guys, we will not do this transaction, and technically it will be simply quite hard to do it. It's hard to make a big energy project with cash, whether it's good or no. Technically it's at the dawn of the history of market in Russia, right? But even you need containers of cash, and it's quite hard to find this cash. So it's technically it's quite hard. But banks will be a key obstacle for energy companies to do such transactions, to make such transactions. And the problem for energy companies is not just the absence of technical opportunity to do this, but also the manipulations of counter agents. Counter agents, partners on the other side, they may say, okay guys, you are not in the SDN list, it's okay with you, but you may be there. You are the company from Russia, and we don't know what will be tomorrow. There is an uncertainty for us. So the price for our services will be twice higher. We need to count the risk. This is the price for our risk. And actually, it's hard to deal with this logic, right? So this is not for energy companies. This is not just the risk not to have transactions as such, but the risk to pay more, even if they are not a part of SDN or even SSI, right? This will be the last point. In case of Russia, Russian energy sector, things are much easier now than in case of Iranian energy sector. So Russia and Iran are quite incomparable in terms of the heaviness of sanctions. What we are having now in Russia is a paradise in comparison with the sanctions regime against Iran. But anyway, we should be quite well aware of the risks, and our companies should have concrete strategies of dealing with financial institutions and taking into account their fears and concerns in terms of secondary sanctions, as well as to have a strategy of dealing with their counter agents, and also have a very clear explanation of why they shouldn't increase the sum of deals, or if there is a risk, our companies should be able to count this risk and propose a specific price of the risks to their counter agents. So that's all from my side. Now I propose to start Q&A. Who would like to be the first? Please, we are in an informal environment. Nasty, please.
As an almost candidate to SDN list, I would probably start first. So, first, thank you very much, Adam and Ivan. I'm really very impressed how you develop your studies that you presented, like you present pretty regularly, and we met about 1 year ago. So I have two groups of questions. One about your latter comment, and the first about more about the research techniques. Because I'm really very intrigued how you did it. So my first question to Ivan, I got the point about much higher efficiency of sanctions when we deal with companies, and much lower efficiency when we deal with state level of analysis. However, if we speak about Russia, we have to admit that in most of cases we speak about state capitalism. So in this situation, are sanctions more efficient or less efficient, or are companies that are like formally just companies, but in fact they're very closely or officially interconnected with the state, more vulnerable or less vulnerable, and flexible or non-flexible? So how to deal with state capitalism level? And the question to Adam is like when you deal with Chinese materials and Chinese data, we know that when we study Chinese official materials, sometimes they simulate very traditional way to present the information, but in essence, the structure of companies, the real structure of business owners differ a lot. So do you deal mostly with Chinese sources or with English sources? Because we at our faculty, we now at HEC, we developed the project on big data studies for Chinese partners and so far so on. So like Chinese data sets, let's go very roughly like this. And we see that it's not enough just to tune algorithms. You really need good Chinese experts who will be able to disseminate information. So, how to deal with business and how to study.
Okay, right. So, well, let me. First question was to me, so I will take an opportunity. Well, it's a good question, and I have a very concrete answer. Russian state companies tend to be compliant with the U.S. With the U.S. sanctions regimes. Of course, there are differences in terms of sectors. Defense sector is very specific, and there it shouldn't be. This observation on compliance should not be generalized to defense, because this is a specific area connected to national security, and a number of counter agents of Russian defense industries, they are also following their own national interests regardless US requirements. So there was a case of sanctions against Chinese Ministry of Defense branch responsible for technical cooperation, but this didn't affect their intentions on dealing with Russians. So defense is a special case we will not cover. But if we are taking banks, banks are very accurate about US legislation. Recent Venezuelan example is very clear, when there were speculations in the press that Gazprom Bank is counter agent of PDVSA, which is now in SDN list, and that could mean that automatically Gazprom Bank could be either on SDN list 2 or could have a penalty notice for violation of sanctions regime against Venezuela. But it turned that Gazprom Bank is not going to do this. Right? So another bank was a smaller bank, Mostar Bank, which apparently is focused especially on these transactions. It is now in SDN list. So it is relevant for this small bank directly working with the country. But big whales are very careful. This is quite a reasonable strategy. And this is not just a Russian tendency. Chinese banks with a heavy participation of the state are over-compliant with US demands. Japanese banks do the same. Indian banks do the same. So that's how it goes with financial sector. But beyond financial sector, things are more or less the same. Companies are trying to be compliant. But financial sector is critical because it makes transactions possible. And if banks are reluctant to make transactions, well, what can we expect? So yes, regardless the type of property, banks and others tend to be quite loyal.
So your question was about China's data. How can we analyze, apply data analytics to understand China, given one, the limited access to Chinese data, and they've made it increasingly difficult to act. With Russian, for example, for me in the United States, there are aggregators of Russian press, Integrum, Eastview, that allow me to go over hundreds of Russian periodicals. So I can go from all these different regions and slice and dice and look at different industrial sectors and publications. In China, they have put a wall on that, and they're making that very difficult. So no question, one events data set, but there are 3 or 4 of them. And what we are doing is we're looking for cross tabulation. We're looking to see whether there's an overlap that give us more veracity about that. But then what we are doing, and there are some outfits in Taiwan that do provide access to a larger corpus, not the same as with Russia or with the United States or Europe, but you can get some corpora to do some text mining. But then it's how do you do the text mining? And so what we're doing in Russia, I think the first generation of people that were doing text mining were primarily translating the material and then using the same searches, right? And that's problematic because, as I just was pointing out, even in the Russian and Western discourse, we refer to sanctions in very different ways. Our words are different. Our concepts are different. In China, it's even more problematic because actually in English and Mandarin, our word for deterrence is their word. If you translate that into Mandarin, that's compellence, which is the exact opposite meaning. And so it's a very you need to have people that understand what those word searches should be to do that, and so we don't rely on an automated translation issue. But it's getting the corpora that is the biggest challenge, and so I'd be curious to talk to you about how you guys are actually getting the corpora, because then maybe we can partner and actually doing some of the supervised or unsupervised types of text mining. But I think my basic argument, I'm not a data analytic purist. In fact, I'm very skeptical of data analysis, big data analysis, even though I use it. But I do think it's important to help us get a bigger picture and just put different data analytic techniques against each other to see what shakes out. And then I think what we get, and to me the value of data analytics is we may see patterns that we hadn't even thought about, that then we would test and validate using our traditional methods. So I don't see data analytics as a real good way to validate anything. It's a good way to identify patterns, but you need to do it by triangulating, bringing, like I said, events data with text data, with then maybe some behavioral data on companies, whether or not they comply with the secondary sanctions, or if there's a different measure of trust or volume of trade or market power or something like that you can quantify. So it's really about the triangulation, and that's how we're dealing with it.
My name is Alexander Pivorenko. I'm from Institute of Slovenian Studies, Russian Academy of Sciences. I just want to thank you for the great presentation, and my question is about the sanctions paradox that you mentioned in the beginning. And I would like it to put it in the context of the US-Turkey relations. The point is that they are still like allies. Yes, they are both members of NATO, but despite of that, they have a long sanction history, and they sanctions each other for quite a long period. And it's not only related with, for example, S-400, but because of many reasons. And not only the US sanctions Turkey, but Turkey sanctions US as well. They import some tariffs on cars and alcohol, which looks like very rough. So my question is, first of all, of course, your estimations of these developments, and are relations between US and Turkey improving, or on the other hand, Turkey is not an ally of US anymore?
Lisa, let me say a couple of words about this. I would say that Dan Dresner's paradox is very relevant to Turkish case. So Dresner's idea implies that sanctions are more effective against allies. One of the reasons is that usually the sanctions are moderate, and sanctions which are used against force are quite huge, quite comprehensive. If you look at the programs of OFAC, of the US Treasury, there is no program directed against Turkey now. So formally speaking, there is no special track on Turkey. So Turkey is, well, almost out of US sanctions now. There was quite a successful for the US case when two ministers were, two high positioned officials were included to SDN list, and the condition was that they will be released from the list if, correct me if I'm wrong, that was the case of when an American priest was detained in Turkey, and Ankara released the guy, and these two guys were released from SDN list, right? So this shows that Dennis, well, this particular case shows that Dennis is right. I mean, that Dresner is right. When there were moderate sanctions, and well, they changed the behavior. Well, similar minor sanctions have been recently used against Saudi Arabia when, after the Khashoggi assassination, Saudi citizens, which supposedly participated in this case, were added to SDN list, according to Magnitsky Act. So there is no special program on Saudi Arabia, but Treasury used Magnitsky Global Act as a legal basis to use sanctions, personal sanctions, targeted sanctions against these people. As for the developments around S-400 and fifth generation aircrafts, well, we all know this debate now that Washington threats the use of punishment for this deal. I wouldn't say that this relates to sanctions in the sense we understand them in our research. So of course this will be a hostile step. This will be a political measure, political step. But in legal terms, these are not sanctions, right? So we should approach this in another domain. So formally speaking, we by now we cannot judge about this as sanctions. It's similar, by the way, in the case of China-US relations. For instance, we can, well, formally speaking, there are not so much sanctions of the US against China. And very often in the press, trade war and sanctions are mixed. But in the legal sense of this word, many of the conflicts on the trade sphere are not related to sanctions at all, right? So we should be very clear about this. And so in sum, getting back to Turkey, I wouldn't overestimate the role of sanctions now in Turkey-US relations. They are very moderate, they are very few, and by now this is not something which is a crucial factor in these bilateral relations.
No, I think that's exactly right. I was going to suggest, I mean, this is actually when I put up on one of those slides, we tend to group all these different forms of non-kinetic statecraft together. Like you said, trade wars, sanctions, economic or energy statecraft, and they're very different. And so I would echo Ivan's point about that. However, I do think all of those things are related to an issue about strategy. And the case of the S-400, we're using the threat of exclusion of Turkey from the fighter program if they don't back down from the S-400. Now, for that to be effective as a threat, it needs to be part of a broader strategy towards Turkey. And it's not clear that we have a strategy towards Turkey right now in dealing with this. So this is an ad hoc issue that kind of speaks to the points that Ivan is talking about. But I think one of the concepts that links all these issues together is that when we're practicing them as a coercive or a deterrent element, that there are certain criteria that they have to uphold. Credibility, the capability, the willingness to commit. And I don't think on the Turkish side we have really fleshed out what that is. And so to me right now, it's when you look at the overall U.S.-Turkish relationship, it's not clear that we have a clear strategy for moving from our current state to another state. So therefore, it's hard to see how this threat is going to be effective in somehow altering that broader relationship that you just asked about. So my gut feeling would be that Ivan is right, you can't look at this as a sanction, but I also think it's probably not a very effective threat right now. But there's more at stake at the relationship, but I'm not an expert on that relationship, but it doesn't seem like this is linked to that.
Philip, please.
Good evening. My name is Philip Deswell. I work on the impact on sanction in the financial sector, and especially from a banking supervision point of view, both in Europe and the US. And I would have two questions, one for Ivan and one for Adam. Also, of course, thanking both for very good discussions on this topic. First question is from a policy point of view. We've discussed the current trends and the current impact of sanctions. And based on this situation, what can we determine in terms of outlook for the future developments of sanctions, especially regarding the probabilities of three scenarios, one which would be a de-escalation with lower pressure, second one which would be a new normal, sanctions being the new normal, being a stabilization, and the last one being intensifying pressure of sanction in the future. So in these three scenarios, where are we standing now, and what are the probabilities for these different threats and opportunities and the future forecast developments? Second question to Adam is from a data analytics point of view. We have described past trends, and what these past trends can tell about the future developments. What did you see gathering different type of data analytics that could be patterns or elements for future developments in the sanctions sphere? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philippe, for questions. It's very valuable to get questions from practitioners in the financial sector. I will try to ask in the following way. Earlier this year, we published a forecast of using sanctions for 2019. And our baseline scenario, which we haven't still changed, is that sanctions will escalate if we view them as sanctions against Russia. Due to two reasons. First reason is political, second reason is legal. In a political sense, they will rather escalate than stay stable or de-escalating. Is due to the fact that key political disagreements between Russia and the US, and more generally Russia and the West, are not resolved. And the disagreements we have did not provoke the emergence of mechanisms to deal with them. For instance, we had Skripal case. We do not agree on this, but we did, and the damage of this incident was quite huge. But we failed to do anything to prevent this in the future. And my question to my foreign colleagues, foreign diplomats, is the following, guys. What would we do if tomorrow we have other Skripals? Or 5 Skripals in 5 different cities in Russia or in Moscow or in Europe, for instance? Do we have mechanisms to deal with the issue? What will we do? Will we expel diplomats? We don't have such amount of diplomats to expel them all. Would we impose sanctions for what? Why? Another incident was a Kerch Strait incident. We have quite orthogonal understandings of what's going on, what was there, but do we have guarantees that another incident would not happen tomorrow or today? No. No, not at all. So that's why we are still in business, in terms of business assessment of political risk, we are still exposed to them, and anything may happen at any time, which may provoke new wave of escalation. In legal sense of this word, or in legal sense, sanctions may also, will also escalate because the existing legislation on sanctions in the US, partly in the EU, implies certain measures. For instance, CAATSA requires administration and different departments of the US to provide at least 7 reports annually. Well, about this was 7 reports in 2018. Some of them are not required to be provided again, but administration should constantly do something. On the other hand, escalation is a wide concept. So there may be fast escalation, slow escalation, and the devil is in the detail. I don't see by now a huge appetite on the US side, Adam, correct me if I'm wrong, to escalate without necessity.
Without what?
Necessity. So as it, and the approaches of Congress and administration are quite different in this regard. So Congress tend to be more proactive, well, naturally due to the nature of institution. It's Parliament. Parliament is always more public, more, let's say, populistic in the neutral sense of this word. I'm not going to insult our colleagues in Congress, right? While administration has to be more rational, more functional, and in the Treasury's wise, as we can judge on the basis of what was published in terms of reports, the appetite is quite low. One of the examples is the conclusion of the Treasury that sanctions against Russian sovereign debt are not reasonable. Not because U.S. Treasury loves Moscow and Russia in general, but because this may harm U.S. investors. So yes, the sanctions will harm Russia a lot, but they will also echo in the global financial system, right? So the good thing, so escalation is a baseline scenario, but the good thing is that if we don't have new huge political events, the appetite for it will be quite moderate.
So my research to date,
and we're still looking at it, I think points to several different conclusions. One are areas to look at. One is I think sanctions are becoming increasingly less relevant as an instrument of threat and increasingly a default form of punishment. In other words, they're not effective to deter or coerce, They're really now, we're defaulting to sanctions and using them and paying the costs of that. Okay, so I think that they're more of a form of punishment than a form of statecraft. I think that some of the data that we're looking at here may suggest that in looking at the response to sanctions, it's more not only asymmetrical but orthogonal, and that we may be seeing a correlation between U.S. and Western sanctions and Russia's increasing frequency of coercive behavior, but that intensity of their behavior, coercive behavior, may not be hard power. It still may be more international legal and diplomatic kinds of pressure. So it's not that, again, there aren't responses. There are responses, but they're in different domains than in the sanctioned area. So point being, sanctions can poison and complicate other relationships. And then in the United States and Russia case, I think that is especially challenging because now those sanctions are, as was just mentioned, are congressionally mandated. So it's going to be hard to relieve those things. Okay, so now are we in a new normal, or are we going to escalate? And, I think Yvonne is probably right. I think my reading in the United States is the executive branch is not excited about sanctions, but they fumbled and they allowed Congress to have a blunt instrument with CATSA that have imposed sanctions. Now we're entering an election season with a changed House, and I think the broader narrative about Russia these days in the United States is that the Democrats are much more aggressive on Russia than the Republicans are, not because they're hostile towards Russia, as much as they see this as an instrument to defeat Trump or to challenge Trump. And so, ironically, the people that would be the most open to a conditional approach to sanctions and a more pragmatic approach are now consumed with getting Trump out of office. So the byproduct of that is going to be more hostility, I think, or more hostile actions towards Russia. And so the one thing to watch that possibly could alter Yvonne's projections would be this, Ted Cruz's bill. It's a bipartisan bill that's making its way through Congress that would require, again, more sanctions on Russia for the election meddling, or at least in preparation for the elections, to be highly sensitive to that and put pressure on the executive branch to take action, even though they may be more reticent to do that. So we're probably in this sort of gradual escalation context, at least through the election period. Now, what are the implications of that? I would argue that right now there's mutual complacency. We think this is a least costly behavior, so we're going to keep doing it. And in Russia, there's a sense that, they can survive this. This is not a problem. In fact, it can bolster some support politically and economically around the favored interest groups. I would argue that the new normal could be a long-term problem for Russia, because we're likely to see, especially given the sensitivity in the financial sector, of increasing de-risking. And I think that's the long-term challenge for Russia. It's the de-risking problem. Now, if these sanctions make their way through Congress that require not only sanctions for the election issues, but also increased sanctions on Nord Stream and LNG sanctions, those may bump up, ironically, against some of the social capital and cause more tensions between Europe and the United States. And I think that's the real question, to see how that works out. So ironically, I would argue that the new normal may present medium and long-term challenges to Russia, but an escalation is going to probably cause more divisiveness within the alliance, because the U.S. has less to lose by escalating
on these issues, and this particular administration may be perceived increasingly in Europe as trying to benefit from escalating sanctions. In other words, by selling U.S. freedom molecules to Europe, as opposed to allowing Europe buy cheap gas from Russia. So that would be the ironic twist I would say to look out for, at least as we navigate through this election period.
I've got a couple of questions for Ivan and a question for Adam. My first question is about this idea of corporate sanctions being effective. I mean, you referred to banking sanctions and how banks are very keen to comply with sanctions, and you mentioned that in the context of sort of the energy sector. But it got me thinking about a sort of practical sanction situation like a troll factory, for example. Suppose you have a troll factory in St. Petersburg and the US wants it to stop interfering with elections or these political activities. So you put it on the SDN list and you deterring banks from doing business with it, or maybe internet service providers or whoever. Is this really effective? I mean, that's I think a more practical kind of situation than deterring energy projects, which is not an end in itself. That is a direct sort of political objective. And I'm thinking, well, aren't there going to be small banks in Russia which will somehow be facilitating this company? Is it really going to be effective against a company of that size, that nature? Second question I have, you mentioned the Skripal sanctions, and of course the most interesting thing about these sanctions is everybody's been waiting for this second wave that has never happened, right? So I mean, people in Russia must be talking about this. Policymakers, diplomats, they must be looking at this situation, and what do people read into it? Are people in Russia still expecting we're going to see these sanctions eventually? And what is the interpretation of this? And my question for Adam is really, how far are policymakers in Washington actually responsive to these kinds of arguments? I mean, are they interested in the theory of the effectiveness of sanctions? I do hear some congressmen recently talking about these kinds of issues, saying, we have to analyze the effects and so on. But does it? I mean, do you feel that academic analysis has any kind of real input into the policy-making process?
Well, let me answer this one first. I've long since gotten used to not or being irrelevant, so I would not take this as a call to arms. I mean, I think, like I said, I think this is the curious state that we're in. We're relying on sanctions more and more. They're not having effectiveness. Arguably, they may be counterproductive, but yet there's complacency about it. And I think that the general view increasingly in Washington is on both sides, bipartisan sensibility is we have to do something, and we don't want to do X, and we don't want to escalate. We want the problem to go away, basically, but we have to do something. And sanctions seem to be not hurting us, so let's do it. So I think there may be, I mean, the issue is, to demonstrate what the impact is of these things. And right now, I think the overwhelming discourse in Washington, D.C. is that they don't have effect, but at least we're doing something. And so they can just keep going on their merry way and then calling for more, but not really doing a whole lot more, because I think the primary constraint on doing more is concerns about our relationship with our allies because of the secondary impact of it. It's not so much about, I mean, like I said, on Russia, everybody's looking for blood in a rhetorical way, but not really thinking about what the consequences are. So, I mean, but I do think that from a business perspective, there's a sense that those companies that have been doing business with Russia, and this is what I found interesting on the company side, is that, when the sanctions were first leveled on Ukraine in 2014, the sentiment among even the companies that were doing business with Russian companies was that, well, this will pass. We can deal with this. Then the response was immediately followed up by we have trusted relationship with Gazprom, so we can weather this, and then it'll change and we'll be back to business as normal. Well, increasingly, those, those sanctions are there. Now, arguably, these sanctions were designed in a way not to hurt, right? They were aimed at primarily affecting future business. The one area, and ExxonMobil got caught a little bit in this, in the sort of deep, deep water exploration in Arctic. But other than that, that's been focused primarily on future-oriented efforts. Nord Stream is kind of in a weird state. It's been grandfathered in, but still there's a political debate around it. So, but to the extent we move off of this ambivalence into escalating on LNG, or U.S. then leveling sanctions on Nord Stream, and on those that are providing the construction of that, then I think you're starting to get tensions that are going to be more difficult to ignore.
Jason, thanks for your questions. Well, I will start with so-called Ross factor. Lots depends on how we understand the concept efficiency. Efficient for what? I think that this sanctions related to the issue are mostly effective for internal policy use in the United States. Because using sanctions is a way to report to voters or to Congress that something is being done. Yeah? So the question, how did you address the issue? How did you punish the supposed trolls? Well, we included them to SND store, we do this and that. So in terms of internal policy, theater of security, right? It's good. I mean, good in the functional sense of this word. In terms of dealing with the issue, it's not relevant, of course. This is the way of retaliation, but this issue cannot be solved unilaterally. So, without some mutual understanding and mutual conversation between Russians and Americans on the issue, and Russian and the British side, this is hopeless. And sanctions will not help politically to avoid this in the future, such incidents, such disagreements and conflicts. And this is rather negative than positive. As for the second wave of sanctions, I'm also intrigued, not less than you. My assumption is that one of my assumptions is that the legislation of 1991 is quite outdated. It's quite an old school. So it appeared in different reality when sanctions were about different things. Now we have completely different style of sanctions, targeted sanctions, sectoral sanctions, which are not implied by 1991 legislation at all. So, of course, those norms which are well known in this public law, they can be used. Okay, Aeroflot can be banned from flying to New York. So what? So what? Again, well, it's possible to use it for internal policy ends, but what would this change? However, this does mean that this second wave is impossible. My feeling is that if there is a political will to do this, this legislation of 1991 will be amended in the form of a new public law or a part of another public law. This is already the case for DASCA project, DASCA bill, and DASCA addresses the issue quite directly. Though I think that the measures which are fixed in DASCA are also quite irrelevant. So they are not solving the issue. This is the way of making harm. This is the way of punishment, right? This is a way to self-satisfy that something is being done, but this is not the way to prevent these conflicts in the future. So we'll see. So it's good for us as researchers, but for business, this is of course a huge uncertainty.
Good afternoon to everyone. My name is Oleg Pashidi. I first of all want to thank you for the invitation and organizing this event. Thank you, Professor Stolberg, for introduction of your conclusions and your research. I'm not a researcher. I support my company in this changing time. And I want to ask you, did you notice the change of tones of researchers, experts in states after the investigation of Miller and the outcomes?
Good question. We haven't. We need to. The corpus that I showed you. This is more scholarly and policy analytical. But what we want to do and what we can do is look at some of the newspapers to pick out some of that sentiment. Of course, the verdict is relatively new, so we need to have it. The time period needs to be a little bit longer for us to get a real purchase on it. But that is a good question, and that will give us a sense of whether or not this is all domestically driven versus related to different elements in the relationship. And that's why, actually, that is one of the variables we're going to look at, looking at these events data, which are updated every 15 minutes, because that'll allow us to actually give a bigger picture of what's going on. So yeah, that we're going to, when I come back here in the fall, hopefully I'll be able to show you that.
Let's see, because my personal perception, I see that, I discussed this with my colleagues who are interested on this topic, is actually before they were quite open and oriented for the customers, but nowadays they're closed and quite modest. And it's also a fact, because especially after the recent votes on the new bill, I forgot the name of the new bill related to protection of democracy in states.
Right.
Another one. Yeah. Well, in terms of bills, since the beginning of 2019, there have been almost 70 initiatives on Russia in the Congress. Very different ones. Some of them are very small, like let's demand from the Department of State the transcripts of Trump's conversation with Mr. Putin in Helsinki, right? Or relating to Nord Stream 2, or big projects like DASCA, new version, or DETER, or the new legislation which appeared, a new bill appeared on interference, which appeared 2 weeks ago. They're very different, and of course, a few of them will become public laws. But they may be complemented with each other, like Lego constructors. So some of the points from a bill which would never become a public law may be imported to the bill, to a bigger bill, which will be a law. So this may be a problem of course.
Ivan, also, if you allow me, I want to ask you as well, is related to Russian counter-sanctions. You're aware of the second stage of review in our parliament is suspending review, counter-sanctions related to the changes in our legislation.
Well,
now. Can you please comment on this?
We already have last year legislation of counter sanctions, which turned to be quite moderate, in the sense that the first version, which implied the ban for the U.S. medicine or whiskey or something like that, and other goods, right? They were not included to the final version, and in general legislation implies that the powers to use counter sanctions is vested to the president and to the government. So this is more or less a painless option for business. Now there is another project, a new debate on the change in criminal code, for provisional information which may lead an initiated state to impose sanctions against Russia. And I do not feel much appetite in Russia to move forward with these changes. However, if of course, if it comes true for business and for researchers, that will be a big problem, of course, because this will be a sort of a very uncertain formulation, right? And it will be possible to use it in a very unstrict manner, to put it diplomatically, right? But again, I don't think that in this version it will become a public law. Well, I hope that I will not be mistaken. So, folks, we are working for almost 2 hours. I would love to continue, but in 2 hours I will have to leave to St. Petersburg. So I'm pressed by this train schedule. Adam is in more convenient conditions, but I think 2 hours is enough for us for today. Thank you all for coming. Adam, thanks for your brilliant speech. I really hope that we will be able to cooperate in our research efforts, and it's always a pleasure and privilege for us to receive you here.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.